Okay, this week is Parshas Balak, and like the previous Parshiyot, there are a lot of questions, important ideas to be brought out that provide a lot of insight in terms of everyday life and in terms of being able to understand and appreciate what it is we're supposed to be working on in terms of ourselves, historically, to fix things up according to facilitating the Gula Shlema. Okay, so first question is, on one hand, just a very simple question, but unfortunately it's a question that people overlook because the Parsha just presents itself as if this is the most natural thing in the world, but the reality is that it's important to point out that Moab and Midian were not even in the list of nations that Bnei Israel were supposed to attack and conquer. That really, Midian is to the south. If you look at the map, it's all the way down by Mitzrayim. Moab is on the east side of the Jordan River, and it's not one of the seven Canaanite nations. And Kosh Baruch Hu, in fact, says to Bnei Israel, you can tsar them, you can cause them sore, so they bother us in our way, but you can't actually conquer them. So Moab and Midian were not nations that Bnei Israel were actually, that they actually had to go to war against. So the question becomes, so if that's the case, so why did Balak and Bilam feel compelled to actually go and antagonize the Jewish people and get into this whole mess with them? Because it was totally unnecessary, because of the fact that they weren't even part of the seven Canaanite nations. That's the first question. The second question is that even if they decided that they had to go to war against the Jewish people, they had to actually stop Israel from entering the land of Israel. The question is, what did they think they could accomplish that Sichon and Og did not accomplish? Sichon and Og were the giants. Their job, basically, they were the security system for Israel. They were there to stop Bnei Israel from coming into Eretz Canaan because they had a Masorah going back 40 years, even longer, right? That they knew, in fact, going back to Shechem and to Yaakov and his sons, that they knew eventually at some point in time, because Hashem had promised Avram Avinu that the land would become the Jewish people's land at some point in time. They had a Masorah that the Jewish people at some point in time would approach the land and take it over. So they did what they could do to protect themselves. So Sichon and Og were two giants who were actually placed at the border of Eretz Israel specifically to act as a security system, as a shield against the approaching Jewish nation. That was their job. And in last week's parsha, we saw how Moshe Rabbeinu was able to overcome them, and they were gone. So the security system was wiped away. So what did Balak and Bilam think that they could accomplish that Sichon and Og did not accomplish? That's the first question. This is the second question. Really part of the first question, but it's the second question. So the following source comes from the Shem of Shmuel, Parshas Balak, this week's Parsha, and he says the following thing. He says, the intention of Balak and Bilam, right, was based upon the following. If the Jewish people entered the land, then they would perform the mitzvahs Tului Ba'aretz. The Jewish people, they come into Israel, it takes 7 years to conquer the land, 7 years to divide the land up, we see in Sefer Yeshua. And once the land is finally settled, the Jewish people can actually start keeping the halachas of mitzvahs Tului Ba'aretz. These are specific mitzvahs that are dependent upon the land of Israel. Truma, Maisha, thinking Tai, Shemitah, right, Yovel, all these different halachas to do with the actual mitzvahs that are dependent upon the Jewish people harvesting the land and producing things. And as it's pointed out in the Sefer Thu Apr, that these mitzvahs specifically have a tremendous koyach, tremendous ability to actually atone for the averos of Klal Yisrael. They're hugely important. At some point in time, as Hashem, maybe Parshas Pinchas or Matas B'Tamar Yisrael, to go into what that means. But the basic idea is that the Jewish people would cross the border, come to Israel, settle the land. They'll finally perform the mitzvahs Tului Ba'aretz, the mitzvahs dependent upon the land of Israel, and says the Shem of Shmuel, that would have a purifying effect on all physicality and sanctify the entire earth. Not just they would perform these mitzvahs and the land would be machaper and atone for the averos of the Jewish people. That's itself is a tremendously important thing that you don't have in the Chutz La'aretz at all whatsoever. That the land actually, it's Yom Kippur here almost every single day. No, every single day. That the land, or certainly as the Jewish people are keeping the land, the mitzvahs Tului Ba'aretz, that the land atones for the averos of the Jewish people, which is why, in spite of all the averos being done today, that we're still here, because the land has that property. And certainly when the mitzvahs that are dependent upon the land are being fulfilled on a Torah level. That's certainly the case. And the Shema Shmuel explained that not only would it purify the Jewish people, but actually has a purifying effect on all of creation, the entire thing. And all the bounty would become holy. Everything that's being produced in the world becomes holy as a result of that. And the nations of the world who survive from a portion of this, because we know all the Shefa comes down from Shemaim, all the light, all the divine light that's a source of blessing in this world comes down over the Kotel, over Israel, over Shalayim, and then goes into the rest of the world. All the success, all the brocha in the world, monetary, planting things and eating food, whatever bounty the world enjoys is basically, it comes from the shefa that comes to the Jewish people. So we get whatever we need in Eretz Israel, and then the rest goes to the rest of the world. So as a result, since the nations depend upon the shefa coming down, right, they would have to humble themselves to the side of holiness or not prosper. Right now, before the Jewish people come into the land and conquer the land, so the world is holding the level of the Yetzadas Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Everything's a combination of good and evil, everything, including us. We're there's good and evil combined together. So in this type of world, before the sanctification of all of Ma'aseh Bereshis, so, a person can be a bad guy and prosper. He doesn't have to improve his midos. There are lots and lots of people historically who are nasty people. This very day, in the business world, you have not such nice people. But, you can still prosper. But not if the Jewish people had crossed the border and come into Israel and settled the land as was supposed to have been the case, and then performed all the mitzvahs to Lui Ba'aretz. That would have sanctified the entire world. And now anybody, it would elevate the world to the level of the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And now anybody who wants to partake of this world has to be a good person, by definition. Right? This would force them to abandon their evil and detestable ways, says Hashem Shmuel, in order to become fitting to receive blessing from holiness. Because you cannot be tamei, you cannot be spiritually impure and get from the side of kedusha directly, right? You can't. It's not going to work. Doesn't fly in Ma'aseh Bereshis. So therefore, Balak and Bilam understood that even though physically they weren't in the path of the Jewish people in terms of being conquered, but the result would be that if the Jewish people would in fact conquer the land and settle it, that they'd be spiritually in the path of the conquering Jewish nation. And there'd be no more room anywhere in Ma'aseh Bereshis for evil, which means no Balak and no more Bilam. So they definitely were threatened by the approaching Jewish nation, which is why they had to go out of their way to stop them, even though their nation was not one of the nations meant to be conquered. So, what does that mean? Does it mean the entire nation has to come to Israel, or part of it? Like, at what point in time is it that this actually takes effect? So, it's brought down in the Sefer Kol HaTorah the following very important concept. This is Rav Hillel Mishkalov, one of the main Talmidim of the Gra, who had notes from the Gra about things that the Jewish people have to do to facilitate Geula on the level of what we call Mashiach ben Yosef, the preparatory stage for Mashiach ben David. And he mentions the following thing. He says, it's a very, very, very fascinating concept. He says, I asked our teacher that if it was possible, physically speaking, this is talking back at the end of the 1700s, the 18th century. This is much, much earlier. This is before the land was even settled. This land was still quite barren at that point in time. And he said, I asked our teacher that if it was possible, physically speaking, to bring all of the Jewish people to Eretz Israel at one time, how would it work? Right? We had many questions and difficulties regarding settlements. After much investigation, our teacher answered us, and he said the following thing. If it was possible to bring 600,000 Jews at one time, and normally when we mention that number, it usually refers to not the entire Jewish people, but rather 600,000 males between the age of 20 and 6. That's the core of Klal Yisrael, and Kabbalistically speaking as well, that number is very significant. So if you could bring 600,000 males between 20 and 60 at one time into Eretz Israel to live there, he says, the issues would have to be resolved immediately, because this number is the great number necessary to neutralize the Sitra Achra, right? The Sahara, the Malach HaMavet, whatever you want to call it, at the gates of Yerushalayim. And at that point, the redemption would be completed immediately with the clouds of heaven and great miracles. Because the Gemara in Sanhedrin points out, the Mashiach can come one of two ways, either early or late. If he comes early, and it's mechubadik, it's a very honorable way. He comes riding in a cloud in a very, very uplifting way for Klal Yisrael. If he comes at the last possible moment, the Gemara says he comes riding on the back of a donkey. Many hold, or at least the Maharal points out, based on the Zohar, the donkey is usually the symbol of Yishmael, and it could very well mean, and makes a lot of sense, especially given the situation today, it could very well mean that we're talking about after war with Bnei Yishmael, or having to suffer through Bnei Yishmael. But the important thing is that the Gra is revealing, based upon the Zohar, that in order for the Gula Shlema to come immediately, to be a completed reality on the spot, you have to have 600,000 males between the ages of 20 and 60 cross the Yarden to live at one time, and that brings the Gula Shlema. Now, we know from the Chumash, that's always the number. Around that number is the number that we're trying to maintain, miraculously, even after the Egel Zahav, and later on, Kodesh Baruch Hu, counts the Jewish people other times as well. We always somehow come back to the number of 600,000 males. It's a very, very significant number. And that's the reason why, because this number, as the Zohar points out, that is what neutralizes the Sitra Achra and makes possible, because if you don't neutralize the Sitra Achra, says the Rizal in Shar HaGilgul, then basically he's all over us. He does whatever he can to interfere in the process of the Gula. He's makatreg, and he makes things complicated, and he throws obstacles on our path, and angers the Gentile nations. Like what's going on today. All the obstacles the Jewish people face today in terms of the borders of Eretz Yisrael and settling the land and living in peace are all the result of the Sitra Achra, because he doesn't want the Geula. Because the moment the Geula comes and the Sitra Achra, is still around, and the Geula comes, basically he loses his power, because as the Gemara points out, that once the Geula Shlema finally is here, the Sitra Achra, the Tzahara is shechted, no longer is allowed to exist, so he does whatever he can to fight against it. If we're ruined, if we're doing that which has to be done to facilitate the Gula, so then the Sitra Achra becomes neutralized, and he can't interfere in the process. But if the Jewish people are not paying attention, doing things the way they're supposed to do it the right way, Sitra Achra still has koich, still has power, and he can interfere in the process. So, that is what Balak and Bilam seem to be trying to do. They know, like Sichon and Og, that they cannot stop the Jewish people from entering the land. It's a fait accompli. Basically, it's going to happen. There's not much they can do about it. But what they want to do is hold off the Gula. To let the Jewish people come and conquer the Canaanim. What do they care? They live in Moab. He lives in Midian. They're both from Midian, actually, in the beginning. Right? So, conquering the Canaanim is not the issue for Balak and Bilam. What's the issue? Holding off the Gula Shlema, so that evil people can still do their thing. Can still be part of the world. So how do you do that? By keeping the 600,000th person from crossing the border and going into Eretz Yisrael. That's the whole goal. So how do you do that? How's that going to happen? So again, this was partial. The Zohar points out a very interesting point. He asked the question, he said, what is the spiritual root of Amalek? Above, every neshama down here has a shorish elyon up in Shemaim, up in the Sfirot. Since we see that the souls of Bilam and Balak come from there, right? So he says that it is for this reason Amalek. So in other words, the Zohar is pointing out that the shorish of the neshamas of Balak and Bilam actually is the same as the shorish of Amalek. So Zohar says that's why Amalek is actually included in their names. You have Balak, Beis Lamed Kuf, and Bilam, Beis Lamed Ayin Mem. If you combine both words together, you can take an Ayin Mem Lamed Kuf, which is Amalek. So an allusion in the names themselves. There's kind of a partnership here between Balak and Bilam. They combine together to make one reality, which is why they work together. That we have the Messias of actually Amalek as well. And whenever Amalek is involved, it's always a function of reducing spiritual clarity. Amalek, as the Gematria of Amalek points out, is a Gematria of Safek, which means doubt, because Amalek exists to create doubt in the minds of the Jewish people in terms of national purpose, national goals, what we're supposed to accomplish, priorities. That's what Amalek does, and that's what Balak and Bilam do. So, The Torah says the following thing. We have the episode, first of all, in Shittim, at the end of this week's parsha, where Balak and Bilam send down B'nas Midyan, as the Shema Shmuel points out. B'nas Midyan was the klipa of Taiva. You want to keep the Jewish people out of Eretz Yisrael. There are three main klipot, three main negative vices a person could have that might interfere in the process. One of them is kina, jealousy, and we see it's very possible to live in Eretz Yisrael and be jealous of somebody else. Jealousy is not an ikuv, it's not a block to a person making aliyah and living in Eretz Yisrael. There's lots to be jealous of, and a person can easily do and still survive here and function in Eretz Yisrael. What's the second one? Is gaiva. Gaiva means that a person has pride. Pride is not an ikuv. Let me just look at the Knesset, right? Just look at the politicians in this country. Let's look at people in general. On the contrary, it takes gaiva to be able to survive here, for the most part. The army, without its gaiva, so to speak, would not have the chutzpah, sort of that positive chutzpah, in a sense, to be able to stand up to all the attacking Arab armies. I mean, it takes a lot of self-confidence to survive in the lion's den, which we seem to be living in over here. So gaiva is not an equal. So what's left is taiva. Taiva is personal desire, mostly for personal comfort, to make our lives more physically enhanced. So materialism. So that's what B'nai Midyan represented. That's what Balak and Bilam set up and established, and that was the downfall of Bnei Yisrael. After that happened at the end of the parsha, which Pinchas comes along and saves the day, but that's after we've already lost 176,000 people to capital punishment for their involvement in Avodah Zarah, and 24,000 died from Megefah because of their involvement in the Bnai Midyan. That's from the tribe of Shimon, right? So it's a terrible disaster. What happens as a result of it before the plague actually finally stops, and then Parshas Matos after next week's parsha, Bezrat Hashem, right? What does it say? The descendants of Reuven and Gad had a lot of cattle, right? Materialism. And saw that the land of Yazer and Gilad was a good place for cattle. The descendants of Gad and Reuven approached Moshe, Elazar Cohen, and the princes of the congregation, and asked, Atarus, Divon, Yazer, Nimra, Cheshbon, all the different cities in the land which God struck before the children of Israel, is a land for cattle, and we have cattle. Therefore, if it is good for you, allow us to take it. Do not require us to cross the Jordan. They haven't even conquered the land yet. They're approaching the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and already the first group is rejecting. 40 years later, 39 years after the Meraglim, the first group of Jews historically, after them rejecting the land, Moshe goes ballistic. He cannot believe that these people are actually saying this, and of course Baruch Hu has to, calm them down and say it's not rejection of you, it's rejection of me. In the end, it's an unmitigated spiritual disaster. But the main point is that as a result of Balak and Bilam, 600,000 males between the ages of 20 and 60 do not cross the border. They go to fight. They go on a pilot trip. They visit the place, right? But because they've already decided before they entered the land to live of Avar Yarden, on the east side of the Jordan River, and already relinquished their portion in Eretz Yisrael, Balak and Bilam's plan is in fact fulfilled. And that's the reason why we never fully conquered the land, and that's the reason why exile comes up at eventually down the road 758 years. In fact, the Medrash says the following thing. Likewise, you can take out the children of Gad and children of Reuven, who were wealthy and had large flocks. They loved their property and dwelled in Chutz La'aretz, and therefore were the first of the tribes to be exiled. 758 years later, eventually, 852 years later, the rest of the Jewish people were exiled to Bavel, and in fact, after you take Amalek, the letters of Amalek out of Balak and Bilam, you're left with the word Bavel, because the word Bavel means, as Rashi points out, in Parshas Noach, Bavel like Mabul, a Babel, to confound, to confuse, suffix, doubt, a mixing up of priorities, and the result of that, Balak and Bilam were successful for causing the Jewish people not to enter the land, not to take the land, and to hold up the Gula Shlem until this very day. We are still suffering the impact and the effect unto this very day of Balak and Bilam. The third question was in the parsha. Why was Bilam's leg pinned against the fence? This whole episode with the donkey, that the donkey goes to the right, goes to the left, doesn't want to go forward. Bilam can't see the malach with the sword shlufa. It's all drawn out, ready to strike down Bilam, but the donkey can see that. And the donkey, as Bilam pushes the donkey moves sideways to avoid going forward, right? And squeezes Bilam's leg and actually harms him, and I believe cripples him even, by pushing his leg against this fence. The question is why? Why would that be the case? So again, you have to look at Sod. Sod explains a very important Yesod over here. It says the following thing. It says, the 3 Gilguli, of which Naval was one, in the time of David HaMelech, Naval HaKarmeli, he cursed David HaMelech later on, alluded to by his name, is alluded to by his name, right? The Nun is Naval, the base corresponds to Bilam, right? And the Lamed corresponds to Lavan. So Naval actually has all 3 letters in it. They are all alluded to in one verse, like a partridge, which is the gar, summoning together chicks it did not bear. So is one who amasses wealth unjustly. In the middle of his days it will leave him, and at his end he will be considered a scoundrel, a Naval. So the partridge, says the Rizal, refers to Lavan, who gathered together stones and made Yagar Sadusa in Parshas V'Yishlach, right? The Aramaic translation of a mound is the Gura, mentioned in the Pasuk. Now Chazal teach that until Yaakov joined him, Lavan was without sons. As it said, God has blessed you with my coming. With respect to this, the Pasuk says, right, chicks it did not bear. That's referring to Lavan. After that, he reincarnated into Bilam. Bilam was the Gilgul of Lavan, who had a very expansive nefesh, as Chazal explained on the verse, if Balak were to give me his house filled with silver and gold. He became rich, but not honestly, but from cursing people, as the Parsha says. Therefore he died halfway through his life at the age of 32, I believe. As it says in the Talmud, the book of Bilam was shown to me, and written in it was, Bilam the evil was 13 years old when Pinchas killed him. With respect to this pasuk, right, it says, this is in the middle of his days will leave him. Since Bilam was the middle Gilgul, Naval Carmeli was Lavan's 3rd Gilgul. Therefore it says, at the end he will be considered a scoundrel, which can be taken literally. Therefore Naval spells Lavan in reverse. So it turns out that Bilam is in fact the Gilgul of Lavan, and in fact what's going on over here is the wall, the gather is actually made. It's actually the pile of stones that Lavan created with Yaakov as a testimony that neither would cross either way to harm one another. Bilam, by actually going and trying to hurt Yaakov, the Jewish people, by crossing this point, so by jamming his leg into the rock, it's supposed to be a reminder to Bilam that as Lavan, he promised he wouldn't go against this oath. And later on, after Bilam dies, the Rizal explains he comes back as a rock because he tried to curse and spoke Lashon Hara with the Jewish people. So he came back as a domin, couldn't speak until his tikva was finally finished. Navala Carmeli later on, when he curses David HaMelech, it says his heart became like stone. And the Rizal explains later on that that's because on some level, even if he himself didn't consciously remember that he was Lavan the Bilam, eventually Navala Carmeli, and he became a stone to mechaper for Bilam's mistake. But his mazel, this upper spiritual reality of our being, of our neshama, that is in touch with higher levels of reality, that does know past, present, and future, even if we're not aware of it. But we can sense dread, we can sense fear inside of our being, because our mazel sees things. So when Naval HaKarmeli cursed David HaMelech, so his mazel recalled that as Bilam, he did the same thing, and he was supposed to be mechaper, he was supposed to rectify it. And now by cursing David HaMelech, in fact, he was setting himself up for another Gilgul, more punishment, because of the fact that he had not completed the process of Tikkun, that he'd begun ongoing the entire time through from Lavan to Bilam to Navala Carmeli. So again, we see in this week's parsha, just like we saw in last week's parsha, just like we saw in Parshas Korach with Korach and Moshe Rabbeinu, Kain and Hevel, that the driving force of individuals in an everyday, here and now type situation is not necessarily just based upon the present day reality. That very often our neshamas, we're here to metakan ourselves, we're here to fix ourselves up. Every time we come back is a gilgul, and today everybody's been a gilgul, everybody's been around, probably, if we're living today, more than likely a person's come back several times in life. We look at our everyday realities in terms of our present day life and assume that whatever is going on and what we have to rectify is only relevant in terms of who we are today. But as much as the body may be new and part of this world, part of this present day existence, the neshama inside driving those bodies has been around for a long time, undergoing many tikkunim in each and every time. And when we come back in a world, whatever life we come back in, we come back not to rectify our strengths, of course, we come back to rectify our weaknesses. So therefore, a person has to look at themselves and understand and ask them, what is it? As Rizal points out, the first question they ask you after you die and leave this world is basically, what was your shame b'tumah? What was the one thing that you struggle with in this world you have to fix and rectify? Tzaddikim, who are working upon themselves all the time, know exactly what that is, and therefore they can answer the question right away, and they go up to the upper levels quite quickly. The rest of us usually either ignore the reality or just learn to cope with it, but we're here and we have to appreciate and understand at all times ongoing that the driving force in our lives is a neshama that's been around for a long time, and we have to come to terms with that and make whatever tikkunim we have to in order to avoid future gilgulim and future yisyonis.